Hi everyone, welcome to part 3 of the credit building knowledge series. I don't even know what to call it exactly, but this is the third time I've redone this, and I know that the way I'm doing it is super inefficient without having editing, and people are probably dropping off in terms of what they're willing to watch. But the reason why I'm redoing this video for a third time is because I keep thinking about how to make it relevant to the average person, because this tends to have more information in it that might make sense to someone who's in the field of lending. And so I've renamed it to basically, what type of borrower are you? And the idea here is to get people to think about what are the habits that they are demonstrating, and what are the signs that they're sending to the lender, in terms of, am I a high quality borrower? Am I a poor quality borrower? Am I exhibiting poor habits, good habits? And so this kind of gets outside. Well, it still involves the credit report, but it involves so much more than what's on a credit report, and kind of gets into probably some of the psychology, in a sense, behind underwriting, and what we're looking for in a borrower. So let's start with a real easy one, and we'll call this the well-qualified borrower. So well-qualified borrowers are going to be those who have several years of history, multiple trade lines, and they don't have anything negative like collections, judgments, bankruptcy, or anything like that, generally speaking. The deep and varied credit piece of it, they're going to probably have some other trade lines on their history, but I also want to clarify that this does not mean that if you don't have certain history, like an auto loan or something like that, that somehow that doesn't make you well qualified. I see 80-year-old borrowers who have 2 credit cards to their name and have paid off their mortgage so long ago that it doesn't even report to credit. That doesn't make someone not well qualified. But what we're going to be doing is looking for other things that help compensate for that. So the things that aren't going to be showing on credit is going to be things like down payment. Do they own their home free and clear? If they don't own their home free and clear, do they have a stable living situation? Do they cash flow well? So do they pay off their credit cards every month? So having minimal, no utilization on their credit lines. But also, if they are someone that has like an auto loan or a mortgage, that we're going to have seen history that they're able to sustain that payment. So someone comes in and applies for a very large auto loan, and the first thing I'm going to look for is, do they have previous history of it? And if they don't, then what are they bringing to the table that helps me understand that they know what they're getting into? So well-qualified borrowers are going to be those people that have large down payments and are also capable of making those larger payments, and have a lot of stability in their life. So another thing too is that typically you're going to see someone who has very minimal inquiries, and new trade lines. So something I think that's kind of cool about a well-qualified borrower is that a borrower that exhibits the behaviors that you're seeing in the bullet points on the screen will have a good credit score, even if they don't necessarily have the strongest depth of credit. So someone can have a 780 credit score, but not necessarily have a super deep auto loan, mortgage, credit cards, other things like that. Basically, as long as they are managing their debts well and they're being really reasonable about how much new debt they're taking on, trade lines that they have, and just overall exercising responsibility, then they will have a good credit score. It doesn't necessarily, by having a good credit score, doesn't necessarily make you well qualified, but you're going to be receiving a really good interest rate in the process. The other thing too is that fifth bullet point about inquiries, is that inquiries have a very minimal impact to credit. I talk a lot about this in the part 2 video, And so if you're excelling with the first four bullet points, you can also still have an excellent credit score. The part that actually has a negative impact is when people apply for new trade lines, open them, and especially when it's revolving debt, that they carry balances on those new trade lines. That's going to be akin to someone exhibiting behavior that they either A, don't have experience handling, or B, it is uncharacteristic of the kind of behavior that maybe that person's presented in the past. And that's going to be where you get into the realm of someone who is exhibiting poor history, or history that is outside of the norm of what a well-qualified borrower would do. So for a limited history borrower, these are going to be your younger folks, or people who've never utilized credit. I see it all the time, people who are in their 30s or 40s who've just never borrowed money before. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but it's going to be someone who has maybe a few payments over a few months, and then also has multiple lines. A lot of times when they apply for one, they then receive a bunch of offers in the mail for others, and thinking that it will help them, they open those additional lines. But also they aren't going to have a depth in terms of being able to handle anything over the bare minimum. So a lot of times I get younger borrowers who go, I want to buy a car. Well, I would tell you, how about you open up a credit card first, show me that you can handle, a $500 limit credit card, that you can pay it off every month, that you can set aside money and save it up before you're applying for an auto loan. Basically the idea here is that instead of someone coming in, hoping that they can make a $400 a month payment, exhibit the behaviors that will demonstrate that you can handle a $400 a month payment, like setting aside $400 a month, for example. But these borrowers tend to have small limits on their cards, and will often carry balances, especially when they hear that 30% rule, keep your balances under 30%, just because that's the threshold that they set. My recommendation with limited history borrowers is that you pay it off in full every month. In fact, actually, I would tell you pay it off multiple times every month, because it depends on when the update happens as to what they see your balance being. Yeah, so there's no benefit to carrying a balance on your card, and especially if you have a credit card from, say, like a local credit union, for example, just to name drop Canopy, where I work. You can have a credit card open for 2 years straight, never use it a single time, and it will benefit you significantly, and there'll be no downside repercussions, because we don't close cards for people not using them. We close cards for cause, for someone not paying on time, for someone who's abusing their card, things like that. But limited history borrowers can also have several inquiries, and this is another thing too, is that it's important to realize that when you apply for several loans at a time, that can be concerning to a creditor. I try to not be particularly harsh on borrowers that maybe they're trying to get access to credit. More what I'm interested in is if the inquiries with other companies are relatively recent, then that might indicate that they've actually already opened up those cards, but they haven't reported to credit yet. So really what I'm looking more for is that if there is any recent inquiries, I want to know if they've opened up those cards. And if they haven't opened up those cards, and this is the first and only card that they've opened up, then I'm going to be much more lenient with that. But a limited history borrower can see their credit score fluctuate significantly over short periods of time. The example I like to use on this is when I had my first, not even my first credit card, my first reasonable limit credit card at the credit union that I was working for. I charged $912 on that card. I paid it off in full because I was doing some home renovations at the time. And even though I paid it off in full, the credit bureau updated at the time, and it dropped my score from somewhere in I think it was about the 760, 770 range, down to like a 708. I think it was 710, somewhere in that ballpark. So it took a massive hit because it basically looked at me and said, you opened up this $1,000 limit card and you've already maxed it out. What the heck is going on here? And so it punished me for that. So that's part of what I'm talking about with the score fluctuating. Even once I paid it off, my score didn't necessarily just bounce right back to a 760, because basically it's still waiting to figure out what your behaviors are and see how you're going to pay over time, before it goes back to saying, okay, you are responsible, you are making good decisions, and builds up that history. The other thing I like to compare a limited history borrower to is going to be someone who's applying for a job and they have no work history. So when you don't have anything on your resume, it's going to be hard to compete with someone who does have things on their resume. And so when it comes to borrowing money, if you have no history of being able to borrow money, then what am I going off of in order to justify why we would give you this loan in the sense that we believe we're going to get paid back? So really what we're looking for is the trend of whether or not that person's going to be using the debt responsibly. And so the better you can handle your debts and show that you're being reasonable. I think another good example might be someone who's jumping from job to job. It's kind of like someone who's trying to open up too many trades, or take out too many loans. They may think that it's helping them, but honestly, if future employers see that you're jumping from job to job every month, why are they going to waste their time in hiring you? In the same sense too, that why are we going to extend money to someone who's constantly taking out new loans and exhibiting what I would consider to be poor behavior? The inflated credit score borrower is going to be someone that follows suit with the limited history. They have a lot of similarities, including limited history of payments. They don't have much in the way of limits on their card. Maybe they carry some balances and things like that. The biggest differences is going to be or come from the fact that they oftentimes will have like an authorized signer card in their name. One reason why these really bother me is that I just found out not that long ago that you can actually go online and you can buy the right to be an authorized signer on someone's card. And while an authorized signer debt doesn't count against you, the payment history on that card either benefits you or hurts you. So if that person whose authorized signer card is stops making on-time payments or starts carrying really high balances, it is going to have an adverse impact on your score. And so kids that get on because parents will make them authorized signers saying, oh, it helps with their credit. I give basically no credit whatsoever to being an authorized signer on something. I don't see how that makes someone a better borrower. And then under newer scoring models, we're seeing people generating credit scores significantly faster. We're talking 1 month potentially instead of 6 months would be the norm before. So really the issue that I have with that is that after 1 month, I have no clue as far as a trend goes as to whether or not you're responsible with that card. If, say, for instance, we get at least to 6 months, I at least now have 6 months of history that you've been able to manage the debt. But at 1 month, that is not long enough to establish a trend, at least not a reliable one. And some of these new bureaus are doing that or allowing for that. And then also, the several inquiries piece is going to potentially impact the inflated credit score borrower, especially if they're utilizing the authorized signer method. They might find a hard time getting a card because they're not going to be given as much credit as maybe they think they should get. And then with the inflated credit score borrower, they're going to potentially have a score that's not justified. And that's what I mean by the word inflated. Is that, if someone has a 770 credit score and they have 12 months of history, that's not justified in the same sense that you have someone who could be 50 years old and has 30 years of history and they have a 770 credit score. So the thing is that this borrower can sometimes say, oh, well, I have a really great credit score. This is what makes me well qualified. When in reality, this actually makes them less qualified, because since we use credit scores to actually determine what interest rate that borrower is going to be at, anyone who gets a 770 is going to get the same exact rate under a normal credit tier system, and so that means that if I'm comparing that person to the newer borrower with a 70 to a 50-year-old with a 770 that has 30 years of history, I'm gonna be much more on the side of approving the 770 that has the 30 years worth of history with no money down or minimal money down, or being as flexible on terms as I possibly can. Whereas the borrower that doesn't have much history at all is actually going to be at a disadvantage, because I'm going to look at that and I'm going to go, in order to get a really awesome interest rate, you're going to need to bring a lot of money to the table, even more so than they would need if they had a credit score that was actually in line with what their history shows. Because if it was in line with what their history shows, I would actually be requiring less money down, because I'm being compensated for the risk by the interest rate. In this case, I'm needing the money down to compensate for offering someone such an awesome interest rate that they technically don't deserve. So that's going to be something that really is an issue in this last piece here, is just on things like a car. That interest rate that's being assigned is dictated by the credit score. So if you have a really awesome credit score, but you're not a well-qualified borrower, be prepared to have a number of requirements put on your loan. Whereas if you have a credit score that's in line with what your history shows, and the interest rate is several basis points higher, 300 400 basis points higher, and for everyone that could be let's say it's 7% would be if you're at a 770, and if you're at a 640 it's going to be at 12%. So in that case that'd be 500 basis points. If it's that much higher, then I'm going to be a little bit more flexible on what my down payment requirements are going to be. And then we have the poor credit borrower. So someone who is consistently making late payments across one or multiple trade lines. So the thing about being late and being a poor credit borrower, you have to actually be more than 30 days late in order to actually have something report negatively to credit. So when I get someone that tells me, oh, it was a mistake, they just didn't take my payment on time, it wasn't that they didn't just take your payment on time. They didn't take your payment on time for 30 days. So at that point, I have a hard time believing that it's the creditor's issue, and that it's the borrower's issue more than anything. So in order to actually get those late payments, you can get late fees that happen before that. But you're not getting the negative marks on your credit until you hit that 30-day marker. This borrower may have a depth of history, but even their good mix of trades doesn't make up for the destruction that's caused from having maxed out balances, being over limit, delinquent, and having charged off debts on their credit report. Another thing too is that maxed out cards and over limit balances, even if payments are made on time, still have a very poor reflection on your credit report. So you can still have a payment history that shows 100% on time payments, but that's only accounting for, if I recall off the top of my head, about 40% of your score. So you're going to have another probably somewhere in the ballpark of 30-40% of your score that's going to be in the gutter, if you're over limit, and even if you're still making those payments on time. Another thing too is that people in the poor credit borrower range tend to ignore the late fees or the max over limit balance fees that they incur on their credit cards, and that tends to add to why they can't get their debts paid down as fast as maybe they would like to. These guys are going to also be the kind of borrower where they're going to show a lot of inquiries, and they're going to be denied a lot. And that's going to be inquiries that differ between the poor credit borrower and the limited history borrower is that we can see on the limited history borrower that they're trying to get access to credit and no one's willing to give it to them because they don't know enough about them. Whereas the poor credit borrower is going to have a lot of inquiries and they're going to say, we know enough about you that we don't want to give you access to credit because clearly this isn't a winning proposition. A lot of times you can look at the data and just say that borrowers that exhibit, these kind of tendencies are more likely to result in bankruptcy and other issues. So this borrower is also typically characterized by having by recently having had limited history, and then now having taken out enough debt that they're unable to keep up with the load that they have and have overextended themselves. This can be due to a life event. This can just be due to poor decisions. But borrowers on the extreme end of the scale, as that debt level continues to rise, are the ones that are more likely to consider bankruptcy. And then the more access to credit these borrowers once had, the more significant chance of bankruptcy being the final step. So someone who once had a excellent credit score will have more access to credit, and then if they fall from that because they've run up their balances and they continue applying for loans and they continue overutilizing, is going to be someone that's going to fall from once what was a great credit score. And we'll talk about that in another screen here. But those are going to be the borrowers that will actually file for bankruptcy and need to do so because of the size of the debt that they have. Whereas someone who has had poor credit for a long period of time and continues making bad decisions, even when they have only small limit cards, that's not going to be someone who's going to choose to file bankruptcy. And the biggest reason why is because it's going to cost too much money to file bankruptcy relative to the debt that they have. So before we get to the on the way down borrower, let's talk about the on the way up borrower. This is going to be a individual that is, these are the people that are my favorite to work with. And the reason why is because they have experience with having had negative history. And now that history is improving because they know what it's like to be at the bottom and they don't want to be there anymore. So the borrower might have a depth of history, but the most important part is that the history that they have that's negative continues to get older, and it's being displaced with new positive history that shows that they are changing their situation. These borrowers might be hesitant to utilize or open credit lines because they will oftentimes associate the previous hardship that they went through with credit cards being evil or credit cards being the cause of their problems, when in reality it's how they utilize the credit card that caused the problems. So, the easier way for them to look at it is say, well, nope, we never want to do it again. We're so averse to the negative outcomes that happened that the best way to avoid it is just to not do it. And while I support that in some ways, that this borrower needs to also be willing to acknowledge that it is impossible to get a really solid credit score without having credit cards. You can go without having a mortgage, you can go without having a car loan, but credit cards make up too much of the credit scoring model because of utilization and because of the weight that credit cards carry and play, especially like in the age of credit. And keeping your score active, because something that they don't talk about enough is that you can have a car loan, pay it off, and if you don't have any other active trade lines going, it is possible for your credit score to basically disappear. This might be a little bit different or potentially changing under these new models, but under the FICO system, that is exactly what happens. I see borrowers who have their credit scores disappear all the time. And then the on the way up borrower might have inquiries from when behavior was poor, but has demonstrated restraint since then. So basically, we're looking for reduced inquiries and minimal new trade lines. So yeah, these borrowers are recovering from what was essentially credit addiction. And so the other thing that's really important is that if you are this type of borrower, expect that you are going to be given a minimal trade line in terms of the size of the limit. Because the thing is that you don't want to be given too much and then fall off that cliff again. And really, what we're looking for is that someone, when we give them a $300 or a $500 limit card, are they going to do with it what they say they're going to do? Because there's a lot of people that will tell us what we want, they think we want to hear, and then exhibit completely opposite behavior. And then for the on the way down borrower, this is going to be someone who once had good credit history, and this again ties into the poor credit history borrower. But they needed to at one point have good history in order to get the credit lines that they have. So someone with poor credit doesn't just get a $15,000 credit line. They don't get a $50,000 auto loan. It doesn't work that way. So that person's going to have had to have demonstrated good history before and had potentially even a solid credit score before in order to have those lines. And so that person, when they start maxing out those lines and they start trending down, that is what we mean by saying that they're on the way down. And so this person can even have a good history of making payments, but that history quickly is overshadowed by having an unsustainable debt load, or maybe even starting to make some late payments here and there. We look to at how many trade lines have been opened in the last 24 months, and someone who's on the way down very possibly might have opened up several during that time. I have seen in some cases in excess of 20 revolving trade lines opened in the last 24 months, and things like that that show it's excessive, show that there's a serious problem with someone's thinking, or at least what their goals are. Something that I think is a really important one to consider with being on the way down is that a increasing debt load is typically going to be unsecured debt, and might even include a previous debt consolidation loan. So someone who says, hey, I want to consolidate my debt because I want to get out of this hole that I'm in, that's going to be someone who's potentially even more dangerous when it comes to lending to them, because we see it all the time where the person does a debt consolidation, goes back out, and even if we close the cards, opens up new cards in that process. And if you thought it was unsustainable debt loads prior to having it, the consolidation loan, now look at what it would be if that person doubles that debt and then has the debt consolidation loan to pay as well. And so that's going to be something that is particularly concerning, and a lot of times why we'll look at saying, okay, we're not willing to consolidate everything, but we're willing to do a partial consolidation, or we're willing to do something if the individual has collateral like an auto or something like that. But on the way down borrowers means they were at one point the top of the credit score pyramid, and life changes oftentimes are what contribute to a series of poor financial choices that are leading them towards bankruptcy. So this is the borrower that represents the most risk to financial institutions, because they're the ones that tend to have the most money borrowed, again, versus a poor credit borrower who maybe has like $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 outstanding in terms of loans. Someone who's on the way down is someone that could potentially have tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of debt with a financial institution, and it's only inevitable that they eventually get to the point where they are going to cause the institution to lose significantly when they default and they file bankruptcy. Another thing about on the way down borrowers versus poor credit borrowers, they have a tendency to have better incomes and think that their job is secure, and that's part of what pushes them to borrow with this false sense of security. So, someone who's in the poor credit borrower range, we do tend to see lower income borrowers that are doing that. But on the way down borrowers can very easily be someone who's making, $7, 8, 9, $10,000 a month, and borrowing money in a way that is sustainable at the time, but then once they lose their job or once they have their life event happen, they've now tapped out their resources and don't have any ability to continue paying. And just another interesting thought is that the on the way down borrower is also indicative of a lot of people that file for bankruptcy, because like I mentioned before with the poor credit quality borrower, is that if they only have $3,000 of debt, it costs at least $5,000 last time I checked to be able to file for bankruptcy. And so someone who has, $3,000, $4,000, even $5,000 of debt, why would you pay to file for bankruptcy when you can just pay off the debt and then not have to deal with the bankruptcy? Whereas the on the way down borrower, if they have 50, 60, $100,000, worth of debt, that's going to be someone who's more likely to file bankruptcy, and that's going to be someone that at one point had to have had a good credit score to be able to have taken out those loans. So people that are borrowing money and then filing for bankruptcy often tend to have good scores, and before their scores get to a point where it's really bad, that's when they tend to file for bankruptcy. So yeah, that's the end of this one. Like I said when I first started making this video, is think about some of the things I talked about in the habits that you're demonstrating, and which category you fall into. Obviously the well-qualified borrower is going to be the one that makes my job really easy, because it's someone who's demonstrated that restraint. But then if you're someone who does have limited history, or if you're someone that is on the way down, think about how you're utilizing debt, and what's kind of caused that spiral to happen. Because unless you're able to fix that spiral with the case of like an on the way down borrower, a lot of times we'll issue a decision back that says, okay, we're willing to do a debt consolidation, but only if you have collateral, or we're willing to do a debt consolidation only if you only up to like 70% of the value of your vehicle, because basically what we're doing is we are planning for things to not go well, and so these borrowers, while they might seem motivated, that motivation fizzles out very quickly when it comes to continuing to exhibit those same behaviors, and after the consolidation, going and taking out more money that is not benefiting them or improving their situation. So anyway, I will stop there with this one. I'm curious in the comments if anyone has questions about these categories, and if they're brave enough, what category or what type of borrower you fall under. And I'd be interested to hear what everyone has to say. Thanks.